the opinions of Democrats and Republicans on climate change related issues in the US increasingly are separated from each other. So they really live in different worlds. People adhering to the Republicans increasingly believe that climate change is exaggerated, that it's not true that there's such a big problem, and so on and so on. And people on the Democrat side increasingly believe the other thing, exactly the opposite. And that is based on large-scale surveys, so it's not just impression, but this systematic research, Pew survey data. And of course, that's a big problem for democratic societies. How can you come to consensus? How can you come to decisions on how to address such a big problem if half of the population says it's not there and the other half says it's extremely urgent? So that is the first example of how polarization is really a big problem for our societies. And what you see here is a second example, also based on Pew data. This is another aspect of polarization. It's not disagreement about issues, but it's negative views of other groups. And that goes together, of course. So here we see, based on these Pew data, that adherents of Democrats see Republicans increasingly negative, unfavorable in the population, and the same on the other side. So more and more distrust, negative views of the other side, and that of course goes together with not believing what the others tell you, not listening to them, and so on. So that's a very worrying problem. And it's a complex problem. I think there's not much needs to be done to convince you of that. So suppose we want to understand a development like this. So this is from this slide that somehow disappeared. Here we see an increasing here we see how adherents of the Republicans increasingly are convinced that climate change is exaggerated, and adherents of the Democrats increasingly convinced that this is not the case. If we want to understand a dynamic like that, well, lots of things come into play, right? First of all, social conditions change, and that could be the typical way how social scientists would approach this problem, saying, okay, maybe it's because inequality increases. Maybe it's because there's so much segregation in our society. Here you see a map of Amsterdam showing you how different, in this case, ethnic groups, but it could also be social classes, are distributed across the city. So they don't live together. They are not mixed, but they are clustered and segregated. Or maybe it is because people have different beliefs in different groups of the society, and that makes it very hard for them to be open to each other's arguments. But how these conditions really enter into the dynamics that we try to understand depends on what goes on in the micro-level processes, right? How do people influence each other? How do they interact with each other? Which assumptions do we make on the theoretical side about these underlying processes? Which theories do we have and which data do we have? For example, based on experiments about how people influence each other. Some of the research we do is on this side, so we do experiments, try to understand how people influence each other, and we have also seen some of this kind of work here already, which I think is really great. And that gives us then still not the answer of what drives these processes, but now we need tools to, well, bring this together and to integrate all this knowledge into models that can make us understand these complex dynamics. So in the end, and that's of course the vision, the ideal we would like to achieve, we have hopefully at some point empirically grounded agent-based models of opinion dynamics in complex settings that can tell us under which conditions we could expect something like this, strong polarization, maybe this chaotic kind of opinion dynamics, or maybe, after all, a trend towards consensus. In my talk today, I want to focus on one particular aspect in this whole picture, and that's the role of segregation. Well, why am I interested in the role of segregation? Of course, I could also be interested in all these other things as well, and of course we need to be interested in all these things, but I want to focus on segregation. Well, for one thing, because we have different theoretical arguments and ideas about what could be the effects of segregation on polarization and opinion dynamics. So a first step one can take in this investigation, and we are working on this for a while, is to try to make these theoretical intuitions people have more precise. And computational modeling, agent-based modeling, is a tool for doing that. Let's look at some intuitions. So here's one intuition. This is, well, yeah, you see here some quotes from various papers. This is already fairly old. Bill Bishop has written on this in the US, so arguing, well, we see this tendency towards increasing sorting of people in the population due to all sorts of mechanisms. For example, income differences increasingly determine where you live, whom you meet in your neighborhood. That was more the point of Bishop. And arguing, well, this really is tearing us apart as a society. So we don't interact with other people anymore. We don't know what they think and what they feel, and we don't understand them anymore. Obama, in his farewell address 2007, was looking into this more related to social media. We retreat in our own bubbles and we don't interact with people from other groups anymore. So this sorting of people, grouping like-minded people, tears us apart is sort of one intuition. Then there's a competing intuition. Well, here we have Mark Zuckerberg, who has been in the news quite recently again. So he expresses this intuition that if you bring people together who are too different from each other, maybe this is actually fueling conflict, fueling their dislike of each other even more. And so maybe we should not do that. This is related to social media, but you could, of course, also relate it to, for example, segregation patterns in cities. Should we mix or not mix people from different social groups if we want to well, avoid, for example, conflicts and polarization? Well, next step would be to model these intuitions, and we did this in various papers. I just briefly skip over this and don't talk about the details because I want to talk more about other things. And many of you have seen some of this before. So this would be the first intuition: grouping like-minded people together tears us apart. We built a model already many years ago, and that was also together with Michael Mess, whom I was mentioning before, where we basically combine these ingredients of the so-called persuasive argument theory from psychology, which argues that if people form an opinion, they do that based on arguments. The more pro-arguments they get, the likely they are pro, and same for con. Influence means I give you an argument, pro or con, and thereby I influence you. But then there is homophily. People tend to be such that they interact more likely with more similar others. And if we are more similar, we're also likely to have more similar arguments. And, well, if you combine these two processes, that means that we are more likely to see this process where similar people, so up here, where similar people interact and thereby strengthen their views they already have and thereby drift more towards an extreme opinion. And we are less likely to see this process down here, where dissimilar people interact and by getting arguments that contradict what they already believe, become more moderate. So this is more moderate than that. Grouping people would drive us to more extreme views and disagreement with the other side. That is what follows from this kind of model. We played this through when what could be the effects of spatial segregation on this kind of dynamic in various papers. Here's the first one where we did this with former PhD student Thomas Feliciani and Joachim Tortsma from Nijmegen University. Well, here just a glimpse on the kind of implications that you get and the dynamics that you get. So if you have here a low level of segregation and groups have different opinions to start out with, so different sets of arguments they start from, their disagreement does not really grow very much over time. But if they are very highly segregated, then pretty quickly we see a strong level of disagreement and polarization coming up. And we also, of course, have analyzed this more systematically in various papers, and I show you here just one result from a published back then in the Organization Science paper with Michael Mees, where we showed that if you increase what we call here demographic fault line, which in essence comes down to the same thing as segregation in our models, likelihood to interact with similar people. So if the likelihood goes down to interact with dissimilar people, the level of polarization goes up, driven by this dynamic. Okay, that was intuition 1, but then intuition 2. Now we have, again, plausible sociological, psychological theories, social balance theory, cognitive dissonance theory, and so on, telling us that if we interact with people who are too different from us, we may not like to agree with them, we may want to disagree with them. Schweitzer has also worked on this a lot. And so that may drive us apart. And if we interact with people who are relatively similar to us, we may come to more moderate positions and, well, not become extreme. Again, in the various papers, we formally modeled this and translated this also into models in which we explored the effects of segregation. And here you see then what came out of this using different modeling paradigms. Here, one where we have just very simple circle networks, and here one where we have a more spatial approach, but it comes down to the same thing. The more segregation you have, the less polarization you get. So exactly the opposite. Intuition 1, intuition 2 result into different formal models. And let me see, this should actually move, be a movie, but it does not. Oh, wait. Well, so I skipped that. So next step, will this also still be the case if we make the spatial arrangement in these models more realistic? Because so far this was, of course, all very stylized. We created these segregation patterns with shelling type segregation dynamics. Not very realistic. So in the next step, and this is work with Thomas Feliciani again and Jochem Tolsma, we used data from Statistics Netherlands, which at Statistics Netherlands, they have these data on which give you information about the socio-demographic composition of 100 by 100 meters squares of well, basically all of the Netherlands, if there are enough people living in such a cell, because it's not enough, then the data will not be revealed for privacy reasons. And we could use that to, say, approximate the real, in this case, migrant versus non-migrant composition in space of a city of like Rotterdam. I call it here a digital twin, but let's be honest, it's not really a digital twin. It's not a twin, it's just a, well, it's not even a sibling, but some wake image of the real thing. But we could integrate these things, so ethnic composition, segregation level, variation of districts in size, their different geographies. We could import all that into the model. And if you then look at, well, a particular case, we could say, okay, we allocate here the individuals. We give them, for example, an ethnicity and an opinion based on what we know from the real data. And now we can run the simulation. For some reason, I'm afraid this does not really move here. I guess I have to leave the presentation mode to make it move. Yeah. Well, I know from experience that you, does it? Okay. Okay, so now they start all out very moderate, but they start to become red and blue here in these mixed areas. So this is for the repulsive influence intuition 2 type of model. And then you see how the red and blue colors, so the extreme views, start to spread over the rest of the city if the dynamic continues. Now we are there, so now most people have adopted an extreme view, either red or either blue. I should put a big warning sticker on this. This is not reality, this is a simulation, right? It uses certain assumptions about how people influence each other, which are not necessarily true. But this plays through what would be the implications if this were the process. So, yeah, well, you can try to. Okay. Here you see it starts at the margin that these individuals become white and black, which means they adopt extreme opinions. So at the margin where different groups are facing each other, it's likely that they start to distance from the view of the others because here they see the differences, and then it slowly spreads into the interior of larger areas, but in these interiors it's still relatively moderate. Here and there, these grayish areas mean relatively moderate opinions. Again, big warning sticker, this is not reality, this is a simulation based on unrealistic, potentially unrealistic assumptions. If we take this to the spatially realistic representation of Rotterdam and we compare these districts, then we can also here see how if what we call the outgroup exposure index in the district is closely related to the level of polarization that you get in these simulations. So on the input side, this is realistic, more or less spatially realistic. On the side of what the model generates, it's a what-if scenario. What if people would really follow these rules of how they influence each other? From experimental work published elsewhere, we know that this assumption of repulsive influence, wanting to distance you from the views of others, is not a very realistic assumption. We see this only under very extreme conditions. So that's good to know. Which also led us to, in the third step, ask the question, and now we are doing purely empirical work, which of these two associations finds more support in the data? So do we see a relation between more segregation, more polarization, or do we see the opposite? And here is really Jochen Tosmer from Nijmegen University and Thomas Feliciani who did the main work on this part of the research. How do we do this? We use the local polling stations of national elections to get an idea of the local political polarization in an area in the Netherlands. There are thousands of polling stations in the Netherlands, so fairly fine-grained. For every polling station, we know the distribution of votes over the different parties in the participating in the elections. And for all the parties, we can assign them to positions in a two-dimensional opinion space with conservative, progressive as one dimension, left, right as the other dimension. We get that from survey data, right? And we can then use the distribution of voters on these parties to tell for a particular polling station how much polarized is the voting outcome here in this polling station. Basically computing an index telling us to what extent voters are split between parties which are very distant in this two-dimensional opinion space from each other. Here you see an example of a quite polarized polling station with a left-wing party being very strong and a right-wing party being very strong. And here you see one with a very moderate outcome with centrist parties being very strong and the others not so strong. And here you see this for the city of Amsterdam, that the level of polarization is fairly low in these areas and it's quite high in those areas around here, which are socially more heterogeneous, you could say. Okay, that is the polarization. Now the segregation. What we do here is we compute catchment areas around polling stations using Voronoi diagrams from spatial data, all done, by the way, with R code. So it's all also open science based, if you want. then we can, for each of these raster points, in this 100 by meter raster points, we know the data about the composition of the local composition of the place there. And we can, for each of these raster points, compute how segregated the neighborhood is to which that raster point belongs. So the catchment areas and the neighborhoods are two different things. They overlap. But now we can say for each point here, well, given you are living in a certain neighborhood, some may live in this neighborhood, some may live in that neighborhood, what would be the average level of experienced segregation of a voter, represented by this 100 by 100 meter raster points, in that area? So that is what we have, an indicator for polarization and an indicator for segregation, both on the level of the polling stations, of which we have quite a few in the Netherlands. Well, results. So far, and this is all very tentative, still work in progress, we actually looked at to begin with, two different forms of segregation. Ethnic segregation, differentiating non-Western immigrant background citizens and others from each other. How much segregated is an area according to that criterion? And the other type of segregation we looked at is SES, so socioeconomic background, basically educational level. How much segregated is an area in that regard? And in the analysis, we first of all, this is basically a regression analysis, we first of all looked at what is the effect of the heterogeneity of a certain area. This is not yet segregation, it's just heterogeneity. So how heterogeneous is the area around a polling station in either ethnic or SES terms? And to what extent does that explain polarization? That is what you see here. And basically it tells us heterogeneity is increasing polarization. So the more diverse the area is, either socially or ethnically, if you want, the more polarized the voting outcomes are. But what we were interested in is what is the additional effect of segregation on top of the heterogeneity. And that is what you see here. And here we find something that, well, is still a bit puzzling. We're still thinking about this. What comes out is, with regard to ethnic segregation, more ethnic segregation goes together with less polarization. And with regard to SES segregation, educational class segregation, more segregation goes together with more polarization. I have some speculations, some conjectures, why we find these results, but that is still, of course, we're still thinking about it, so I'm very interested in your thoughts on it. So this is basically the main result we get from this kind of research. So you could say, well, for the one kind of segregation, intuition 1 is supported. For the other kind of segregation, intuition 2 is supported. And that would be, so far, the tentative conclusion. And as said, it's work in progress. And that is where I end the content part of my talk. And of course, we can think about what could one do about this, what can policymakers learn from this, and so on. I think that these are very important questions, but I didn't touch upon them so far. But I want to end with giving credits to many people involved in this kind of research.